Pasha, well,
Hey, it's great to be here.
listen, man, I know we go back a couple years on LinkedIn, chatting back and forth, but I'd love if you could just spend 30 seconds, just give us a little bit of background on yourself and a bit about what you're focused on now. It'd be really helpful just for some context for this conversation.
Yeah, so I've been in this industry for probably close to 17, 18 years and kind of cut my teeth as a website and mobile app technical project manager. Also did a little bit of branding, worked at small agencies, big box agencies, B2B, B2C. And that was probably the first 4 years of my career, with the last 14 really being focused on B2B marketing, sales and revenue operations. So at my last company, I was VP of digital, oversaw kind of all paid and demand generation along with our HubSpot partnership. And then 3 years ago, my co-founder, Suzanne Block, and I started Shape and Scale. She does technology PR, and I am a HubSpot Gold partner, HubSpot certified trainer, winning by design, certified revenue architect, and help my clients with kind of operationalizing their go-to-market in HubSpot.
I love it. I've always loved your takes on things. I'm just kind of coming from the industry, from the agency side when you were in-house, now where you are working at probably the closest level we could imagine to what organizations are facing from a tech stack perspective. One of the things I
Yep.
wanted to cover is just like, I feel like as a solution services partner, whatever, agency vernacular you use, effectively the majority or a big portion of your business is designed around a service because of the gap that the HubSpot ecosystem has. Like there's a ecosystem out there where organizations don't know how to untap the full value of a piece of technology. And so they pay good money to a third party like you to come in and help them optimize that experience. So like who better to talk to about this kind of tech stack adoption challenge
Yeah.
and what these things look like than a service partner. So I've got some thoughts and kind of how we got in this mix, but I would love to hear from you kind of like where you see some early symptoms of just the poor tech stack adoption, or like where you see when you come in for a client, you're looking at it for the first time, like where do you start with somebody as you're unpacking their tech stack?
Yeah. I mean, it's an interesting question. There's probably a couple ways, and it's just depending on the type of engagement that we're in. Usually everything I do starts with an audit. And so that audit's going to look at really two main items, right? It's going to look at the technology, and then it's going to look at the process. So the process is interviewing stakeholders. It's starting to kind of get a feel of where the disconnects are, where pain points are, what's working, what's not. And then obviously from a technology perspective, it's really looking at their systems, right? And looking at how those systems are interconnected. In HubSpot, you just go to the integrations, and I kind of have a sixth sense for this because I've just been doing it for so long, and I've just seen every kind of like MAR and sales tech. So when I look at those integrations, then I see Kixi, or I see Datavox, or I see Salesforce, or I see Apollo, or whatever it is that I see, I can start to put together a story in my head that kind of says like what they're doing, why they're doing it, and how they're doing it, right? Like a lot of those pieces of technology can inform how I envision they're going to market. And then we use those kind of customer interviews to blend those two together. I mean, that's honestly where we and myself usually starts.
So yeah, I mean, I think the very common to just duct tape a bunch of stuff together. To me, I think it's this like 25-year arc that we've seen in SaaS, which is like this narrative that buying the solution equals solving the problem
Yep.
versus where we know all the values actually realized is in the implementation, the adoption, and the operationalization of that program, of that piece of tech. And so, I think that that's one of the main things that we see is the shiny objectness of like, oh, cool, this is a new tool. I can just bolt on and add another thing and just keep going. You had a really great post where you're talking about like you were that guy early on where you were always recommending a new tool for the new problem. Can you talk a little bit about that and kind of like, what the realizations were as you.
Yeah. I mean, I think you see it today with the golden child Clay, right? Like everybody's like, oh my God, Clay, like Clay. And like, look, love Clay, amazing tool, amazing story. But there's harsh realities when it comes to using that, right? Like if you're using that with HubSpot and you want a direct integration, costs $800. There's also just a technical upkeep to it. And there's a learning curve that's really, 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 it requires a certain skill set. People hear it, They want to use it. Hey, should we be using it? But usually when you start unpacking what's like actually behind that, you're going to find out that you can probably do things like way easier by using like a scraper like Apify and Make, right? Like just using that as an example. That's not to say the clay isn't like, again, great and it can't do amazing things. But generally, we always recommend starting small, building yourself an MVP, building yourself like a use case that you can test before you start just investing in them. It's like, well, are we going to have a clay agency or is somebody internal going to manage it? Or are we just going to have somebody part-time? I mean, just think about how that takes away focus from the actual mission, right?
Yeah, for sure. I wonder if you have any tips or tricks when you're talking to organizations about kind of getting to that root cause. Cause I think that's exactly what you're describing here is like,
Yeah.
are we automating for the sake of it? Or are we actually like, let's go back to the real reason we even started looking into these tools to start with.
I mean, I think one of the things that I do with HubSpot that's always crazy to me is I have a customer journey map. And obviously that customer journey map not only looks at the customer journey, but it also, so if you think of an iceberg, above the water, you're going to have pretty much everything that's occurring externally with your prospect as they move from unaware to aware to renewal to evangelist, whatever it may be. But then underneath the water is everything you need from a technology perspective, not only to support that journey, but then as it relates to that technology, objects, properties, fields that are important, not only to getting the information that you need from them, but also the communicated value within the organization, right? If you don't understand your customer journey, which I mean, 50% of clients usually don't have that on hand. And I work with anywhere from Series A all the way up to small to medium to enterprise. How could you ever put together a list of needs that are actually focused on your user as opposed to just your idea of what you need to have because people on LinkedIn are talking about it? There's no way, right?
Absolutely. It's huge. You also talked about jobs to be done. I know you have some good frameworks for how you kind of roll that out as a program or a workshop. Would love to
Yeah.
know like where you position that in this because I can see the pushback being like, well, here's our process. And then as to your point, you go, well, like, let's actually look at the process then. And maybe it's not just move before the tool, but actually move before what the process, like what good looks like in the process. So the jobs to be done thing, I'd love to think about or hear how you think about that.
Yeah, I think I'll start with what good process design looks like and then talk a little bit about how we can use user stories or jobs to be done to fill in those blanks. Good process design is going to look like clear ownership and handout between teams, consistent terminology across departments, some type of defined SLA, so iterative improvement cycles built in, and then visibility into process performance. None of those things that I just mentioned have anything to do with technology, right? They can all be managed in Miro, Lucidchart, and a spreadsheet. I think where I'm starting to get to more and more with my clients is for the first month, we're not working in any type of system. Everything's getting mapped out on paper before we're able to put that into like whatever technology is that we're using it. As it relates to how we might onboard a client, or if we're working with a client that has maybe a list of requirements, one exercise that we find that works really well is just doing user stories, right? So working with our clients to understand for kind of each goal that they have or each objective that they have, how is a user thinking about that, right? And that can be jobs to be done. That can be like a UX perspective user story. And within that, you're putting yourself, you're either interviewing your team or you're actually putting yourself in the position of that user. And you're saying like, in using the sequencing tool in Apollo, like I'm trying to achieve X, right? And this is why. And I think once you get people thinking like that, it starts to crystallize a lot more like what's a nice to have and what's a must have. But generally, people just skip right through that. You might have a founder that's pushing for, X, Y, and Z, and you think the quickest way to get to that is technology without slowing down to maybe push back, or you just are coming into an organization that already has a lot of technical debt, and you're being asked fit a square into a round hole, so to speak, without being able to. You might not feel like you have the command at any organization to push back So you're just kind of working within the context of what you've been given.
Yeah. I mean, what I'm hearing is like being a change management agent, right? Like a lot of our audience is an enablement professional, L&D, operations professional. The tools are kind of thrown under their wheelhouse, but they're not necessarily subject matter experts in those said tools, but they are really like their job is to figure out how to document and string these things together. I'm really curious if you have any best practices for like that liaison piece that you're doing when you may have like a stakeholder founder and then a group of maybe end user folks who are trying to like duct tape everything together. You've got like maybe misalignment between those resources and you know that change is required and you're the one that has to be the agent for that. But how you maybe get them all on the same page, like any talk track or best practices as you're navigating a sensitive conversation like that?
I mean, a lot of this is like change management, right? So change management can take a lot of different forms and it just really depends on like the size of the organization. I think whenever you're doing requirements gathering, there's kind of this, if you're doing requirements gathering or interviews, like there's this idea to start at the top and like you start talking to department heads. Depending on the size of the organization, you're usually going to find quite a discrepancy in between the pain points that people at the top are feeling and the ones that frontline users are, right? Like there's usually, again, depending on the organization, a disconnect there. So I think a big piece of it is talking to both groups of people, so frontline users and leadership, and then really translating what you hear into actionable requirements, right? And finding kind of the points where those things can mesh. Because without that, you're going to challenge adoption if you're just listening to the people at the top and then shoehorning something in without having any real idea. Because again, if I'm a CMO and I'm like, hey, I just want more leads, like that doesn't really mean a whole hell of a lot to the person that's the HubSpot super admin, right? Like it's just two different things there. Maybe not the best example, but I think you get where I'm going with that.
Yeah, for sure. That's a big one, is trying to figure out how we get the folks who have to, focus on execution to understand what the why is behind the ask or what the strategy is and how that's got passed down. I really like to focus on those requirements. So do you find yourself in that requirements gathering, like you're having those conversations at that level to help make sure that maybe scope of work that we're going to roll out, like you're trying to find alignment there so you don't get deeper down the build process to find out that they're at odds with each other, right? You're trying to start that as early as possible.
Yeah, generally we kind of look at user needs and those user needs are going to be mapped to a life cycle stage. So maybe it's like top of funnel marketing or like post sales funnel, customer success, capabilities that we're looking for. If it's a customer activity, the tool that's being used, what feature state looks like. And so that starts to just become a kind of overview of really what you need. And then with that, you layer on top the user stories where it's like, hey, as you look at the department and then you look at the role, the functionality that's required, the benefit that comes out of that. And once you kind of plug those two in together, it not only helps you as a service provider from an operational perspective to be like, hey, I'm recommending this because of this, but I think it also helps everybody on that kind of client team understand what the other one's thinking. And it helps just harmonize the process for either just keeping what we have and improving in the process, or like, no, we actually need something new, or like, hey, maybe it's just an upgrade.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I can definitely see the placement there where you're trying to break it down to the smallest components possible so you can try to
Yeah.
make sure that there's alignment at each level. Sounds like you're trying to get to the space where we're going, okay, well, we're mapping out what we think good's going to look like. We've mapped out current state where we are. So then that next stage is really like maybe tool identification. Before we get into automations, like we'll talk about that in a second. But I think that's where people jump to, especially with AI now. They jump right into automations, and that's where the wheels, in my opinion, come off. So how do you think about that next stage of like tool identification? Like, do you recommend running that manual process to a certain level? Is there like a capacity? Like, how are you thinking about that before you're really feeling strongly that you can recommend an actual tool.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a couple things, right? If you're just evaluating just general timing for like software purchases and like building your stack, I mean, there's a couple things you look for, right? It's, there could be growth inflection points where you might require new tools. A lot of clients are moving from a spreadsheet and that spreadsheet becomes overwhelming. And it's like, hey, it's time for a CRM. It could be a sign that your team has outgrown current solutions. That could be like, hey, we used to have one SDR doing sequences through HubSpot, and now we've got 10. And guess what? We need to move to Smart Lead AI because we're going to burn our domain, right? It could be you were in the US and now you're going global. And now you had this manual process where a form gets filled out and one person takes it, but now you need some type of, routing. So you're looking at Chili Piper, or you're looking at, it's like there's triggers, just like we look for buying triggers internally, there's going to be triggers for, getting new tools. And if you don't have any technical debt, or you're just in a process where you're evaluating, I think there's a timing perspective. And then there's assessing ROI. So one thing I always talk about is I think organizations look at their technology as just this thing that it's just like tech, right? But in theory, with how much people spend on tech and how many tools you have, you should kind of see it as a revenue generating asset, right? So if you're bringing on board any type of tool, there needs to be a business case with measurable outcomes. You need to look at actual use cases, and you need time to value considerations along with total cost of ownership. So it's not just implementation, but it's training, maintenance, and adoption. So again, if you look at those, you've got to assess the ROI. And then the final piece is kind of just, do you have a plan to operationalize everything? So if we're bringing out a new tool, is there some type of documentation that you can start to build? Is there a kind of center of excellence for that documentation where people can access it? Is there cross-functional alignment? Are there meetings? Are there touch points? So if you look at those three pillars, it's identifying the triggers for the purchase, assessing the ROI around that, and then operationalizing kind of that software. So again, how are we going to ensure that people are going to use it? So when you look at those three things and you're evaluating tools, you start to have a better talk track for when you're talking to salespeople who are trying to sell you this stuff, right? Because like without that, how are you going to push back on whatever it is that they're, pushing on you, I guess?
Yeah. I love this because that framework of those three buckets, or that the 3-step process there, I feel like everyone's really good at the first one, which is like, oh, okay, cool. We've identified a need. We have a need for this, right? They convinced themselves, they've justified that there's a trigger for this piece of tech. But I feel like the ROI bucket and then the operationalization of that is where, most things either fall apart or the market doesn't have the skill set to figure out how to do those things.
Yeah.
Expand a little bit more if we start with the ROI one first. I know this is one of the trickier things I've seen on the other side as a vendor, how we help a company start to think through the process of driving ROI through a tech stack. Do you have any thoughts around that? Just expanding on that for listeners.
Yeah. I mean, it depends, right? Like if I'm bringing on HubSpot, and I'm thinking about ROI, I mean, like one of the first things I would want to do is make sure HubSpot's in a place where I can clearly see how my prospects are moving from lead all the way to closed won, right? And, in working backwards, like if I bring in HubSpot and I move, from let's just say spreadsheet or maybe another tool, if I can't consistently understand why leads are moving from one life cycle stage to the next, then it defeats the whole purpose of really having HubSpot, because having that kind of intelligence allows you to make changes that predictably affect revenue. And so that kind of goes into like what the definition, or there's a lot of different definitions of revenue operations. But I think one of the biggest things is if you have that type of program, you need to be able to make defensible decisions that can predictably affect revenue. So within that, if you're looking to extract ROI, I mean, that's an example that I would use. It's just like being able to not only understand how prospects are moving through the funnel, but putting a percentage on that and truly understanding like why things might be falling, short in either your customer journey or your sales process.
Yeah, so it sounds like working backwards, if I'm summarizing what you're saying here, what is the core objective that we're trying to solve with this tool, working backwards to go, okay, well, from current state, what am I missing out on now by not using something like this? Maybe what are the additional points of visibility, tracking, scalability, whatever those other levers are that you're to invest in, using those as your effectively data points that you can pull from to get from current state to what would hopefully be sort of like actualized state. Because that is a challenge, right? We're using HubSpot as an example here, but reigns true for any tool purchase. And I think that, just focusing on something like efficiency gain, moderately helpful, but it's not really the level of impact that like the C-suite's going to care about, right? Like that's not
Yeah.
something that's not impactful enough.
Yeah. I mean, it's like if you bring on Clay, like you're not really bringing on Clay to enrich context. You're bringing on Clay to better orchestrate your message to like prospects, right? It's more than just like, hey, we're running waterfall enrichment. It's like, no, we're actually doing that. So we can reach more of our ICP with a more cohesive message that has more relevancy and, hopefully can generate more pipeline. This is like a big difference between bringing something on and then actually putting the thought into what you're really trying to do with it, what you're trying to get out of it.
For sure. Yeah. Really helpful on the ROI piece. We move on to the implementation or scaling out this tool. I'd be curious how you help educate your customers on building a true implementation plan for that tech. Obviously, a good ecosystem tool like HubSpot has a lot of documentation around this. They have good process. A lot of other smaller tools, not so much. Be curious how you describe that to your customer. The value is not going to come in the purchase, right? The value is going to come in us executing this and moving from the process we've outlined to the actualization of this with this piece of technology. It's going to take some work. It's going to take some training. It's going to take iterations and version and those sort of things. How do you wrap that up in a delivery mechanism for a customer?
Yeah, I mean, that's good. I mean, for us, it's some of it's pretty straightforward, right? I mean, again, if I'm using HubSpot as an example, they obviously have their academy. So, we put together a playlist. If one of my clients has got Sales Hub, we put together a playlist from the academy. You can share it with them so they can start training themselves on that. I'm obviously a Super.io customer. So with that, like I can embed documentation into the CRM. So that's a big one. There's obviously going to be training involved. So I'll generally do, 1 to 2 trainings. And as a HubSpot certified trainer, I've learned a lot about this idea of training, right? I think the trainings that I used to give maybe 3 years ago were not focused at all. And that, there's a art and science to it. So making sure that you're tailoring your training sessions for like where the users are and what they're going to be doing and really kind of isolating it on their day to day as opposed to really moving away from theoretical to like very tactical, I think is important. And then, yeah, putting in place some type of feedback loop, right? Like not everybody's going to get the benefit necessarily at the same time, but if you roll out, whatever you roll out, you want to have a feedback system in place so you can understand kind of like where things are going right, where they're going wrong. I think, again, it's different, right? I think for HubSpot, they rely a lot on their partners to handle that. Whereas if you're working with like maybe a smaller tool, they might have just more of a traditional customer success team that's like kind of leading you along the way. So I actually think that's where HubSpot wins a lot because they do have these really knowledgeable partners that's co-selling with them. And so we're not only like helping them set things up, there's a huge focus on adoption and like making sure that they're using the tool and getting the most out of it. So I don't want to be overly HubSpot centric on this, but I do think that is why they are where they are.
Totally. Could not agree more. Do you have any advice for the companies who are evaluating these on what the customer can ask of the prospective vendor about that implementation, about that support? I always find it strange that it ends up falling on the end organizations, L&D team, ops team, insert whatever ownership you want. It's on them to learn the tool to its extent, then document, then figure out how to coordinate all of that, get that into training material, then deliver for their people. And to me, that should be a large portion on the vendor to execute. But what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think it just depends on the maturity, right? Like if you're doing a little HubSpot, if you're getting something in the HubSpot app store where it's like a single point of failure for who you're getting it from, you gotta like can't have champagne expectations there. But I would say like generally, you just have to be very clear on your expectations, right? And I think that's what happens a lot of the time. People get put in purchasing decisions that don't necessarily understand everything that goes into it. And so there is that knowledge gap, which I think you talked about, which feeds into why a lot of implementations fail in the first place. And I think that's why most tools out there that have staying power do a really good job of onboarding and kind of supporting. But I do think you have to be an educated consumer in a lot of ways. And no, you're right. When you're dealing with different companies and just making it very clear upfront what your expectations are. And if those expectations aren't aligned with what they can deliver, then you probably have to look elsewhere. When you look at tools, especially when it comes to any type of data enrichment from the Apollos, the Zoom infos, the Clays, what can you expect? And where are the gaps on your team in terms of the upkeep of those writers, like understanding how to use them?
Yeah. We have anecdotal feedback we laugh about internally is obviously IORAD is used to build tech stack documentation and training.
Yep.
Where you YouTube or Google search for best practices for X software, and then you see like
Yeah.
the first 20 results are third-party people that are YouTubers that are filling in the gaps, right? It's
Yep.
because those tools tend to be self-serve or like product-led, or they just really don't have a strong implementation. And like those are really huge weak points. And like we always recommend folks like look through that stuff to start, because it's not that you shouldn't purchase the tool, but just understand what you're signing up for. That means
Yep.
that upon purchase, it's effectively on you to figure out how to transition and translate what the tool can do to your business processes. And if you don't have an agency or third party helping you with that, like that is literally going to be on that internal, training or enablement team.
I mean, one of the first things, if I'm using HubSpot and I'm looking at an integration, I'm going right to the page to see what the reviews are, right? And then I'm going to the community or I'm going to go in a Slack channel and search, right? Like, does it have bidirectional syncs? Like, where does this thing break? Because everybody says they integrate with every other piece of software, but generally there's always going to be limitations. And I think most people don't really know that going in and they're like, oh, there's an integration. It's just going to work out of the box and I'm not going to have to do anything. And that is so far from the truth, man. I see things all the time. It's things break, it's like, oh, we didn't, United States isn't capitalized. So we can't pull in any of the other data from this. And you're like, what? Like, what are you talking about? But yeah, it's just, there's things that trip you up.
Yeah. Especially if you're not an expert in past tools or the integrations or API, you're putting people in seats who they have another job to do. This is just a tool they need to get their job done, right? Now you're expecting to be expert in all these connective tissue pieces. And you wonder why people get frustrated and then just go, screw it, I'll go back to spreadsheets or whatever it ends up being.
It's hard, man.
Yeah.
I mean, it's not easy. Even with all the AI and tools out there, like it generally, there's just a learning curve and it's very hard for somebody to be a master of all of those technologies, even though most job descriptions would say that you need to be, which is insane.
Whole separate topic. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, double clicking on the training piece, obviously this top of mind. We do get asked about this a lot from the community where, trying to make these differences between soft skills and hard skills. And I think you called it out that like your early days of training were very much just like kind of high level and effectively like a product demo, and you're just kind of like having it not overly structured. Where do you see success now? Because we hear very often around like this bifurcation of like, if we can put really good interactive self-serve content out there, playlists from a community, if you're lucky enough to have that from a tool like HubSpot, or build your own step-by-step easy guides that drive users to like get muscle memory down on their own, so that when you're on a call and you're doing actual training, it's on like tactical delivery of a strategic initiative.
It's like if I'm showing somebody how to use the sales workspace in HubSpot, I don't think you can train somebody on that unless you've actually used it yourself, right? Because there's just nuance. And I use sales workspace for my company. And when I'm training teams on it, we're going through how to use it in your day to day. And you're pointing out like, you've got to be able to defend your position too, right? So like if we're going through a scenario and it's like, hey, this is how you might work like a new lead. And like, this is now you don't have to do context switching because everything is in this one screen. And I think people just gravitate to that kind of knowledge as opposed to speaking about it at like this high abstract level. I mean, like, that's why when I'm not working, I'm generally either in the HubSpot community trying to answer questions to see how other users are like using tools or maybe having problems with tools, or I'm using the tools myself. So like I'm able to speak to like as a service provider, I'm starting to run up against like, well, how much do I learn Clay? Right? Do I pay somebody $5,000 to like get me really in depth? Do I need to know it in depth to like speak about it because my clients are asking me about it? Or do I just focus on HubSpot? Funny, it's like very meta. Like I think you run into that too. It's like a service provider. It's like, how much of this stuff do I need to know? Or should I just stay focused on this one core thing? And I think if you look at it from that lens, that should also be injected into your training in a way.
No, it's spot on. I mean, I think with the age of AI, and it's good to kind of segue here, I've been hearing this narrative where like everyone's now going to be a manager, right? Because you're managing AI to help you execute on your job. And we know the tactics of using, a chatbot to be able to kind of like as a sparring partner for your ideas and helping expand upon concepts and cleaning and consolidating and those sort of things. But as we scale that out, we see this automation kick that everybody gets on, jumping to that because when you're looking on your LinkedIn feed, you're seeing effectively a early adopters list of fun, sexy things that stop the scroll about
Yeah.
and automations and these sort of things. And so it goes, oh my God, I'm behind. But I got to get to this. I have to drop everything I'm doing, learn this, implement this tomorrow, because it feels as if that narrative is like, you're just behind the eight ball. And if you don't learn this today, your business is going to implode. We really try to tell people like we work with very old legacy, insurance and financial services. Like they're barely on the cloud, let alone like automating processes. So like,
Yep.
you'll be fine, right? Like but make sure it's within reason. What is your take on thinking through this automation and trying to keep people from jumping over all the things we just covered right to just automate a thing that they probably haven't even mastered the manual side of yet?
Yeah. I mean, I think with the automation, it's just really it like has to make sense. Like I think if you're mapping out all of your processes, it's just really understanding like where you're seeing the most friction, right? And like sometimes friction's good. I think there's like a misconception that everything has to be plus. I don't think that's always the case, right? You might want a manual touch point to review a form fill. If your sales cycle is freaking I just talked to a prospect the other week where they had like some crazy year and a half sales cycle. It was like 300K ACV. Maybe you don't need to automate everything there. I think it really just boils down to understanding like where friction's good, where friction's bad, and where automating something can help not only like internally, but your customer, right? So, that could be as simple as if we're a high intent lead and we route you to an actual AE as opposed to a junior SDR, right? That's good for the customer. So I think about trying to think about it in the lens output and not always be so focused inward, but looking externally toward improving the process for your prospects and your customers. You have to remind people that's actually why we do all this stuff. It's called customer relationship management software. It is for the customer.
Yeah, I think that definitely gets lost in translation and the effort to, optimize and streamline and use a bunch of other, fun SaaS words to make ourselves feel really important. I think there's a lot of redundant work out there, no doubt. But I think the processes that you've laid out here, specifically, I really liked your tech stack audit, which kind of aligns with the process audit effectively. And it's kind of where I wanted to end and wrap up here, because I think that that's it, right? Because this process that you described is helping us to identify what is actual end goal and where ultimately we could recommend once we're at the end of this process, where automation, where scale can happen, where new tooling can come in. So I just wanted to kind of recap on this. From your tech stack audit, you had a great post about this that we'll share. It was step one, deep discovery, kind of going through those decision maker components, current state. Can you just run through those other couple of stages in terms of system analytics or analysis and your recommendations as you wrap up?
Yeah. So, we've used this with most of my work is around HubSpot, but we do tech stack audits and we've done probably like 3 or 4 in the last year. It comes down to 3 main steps, right? One is obviously just going to be a deep discovery, really interviews with key decision makers. Like I said, again, depending on the size of the organization, both not only I would say a decision maker from like a C-suite level, but also a decision maker from I'm actually like doing the work, mapping the current state by defining kind of core user needs, and then really documenting critical business requirements through user stories. And usually coming out of that, you can start to identify where manual processes create risk. From there, it's a system analysis. So just like go to market infrastructure, understanding the flow of data between platforms, applications, mapping your tools against actual business capabilities, rating each system's automation level. And then throughout that, you're going to start being able to identify kind of integration gaps in any like duplicative software, which we find a lot. And then from there, just making strategic recommendations, right? Like building an implementation roadmap, prioritizing highest impact changes first, ownership structure, and then a process documentation framework. So, that something like that can take 2, 3 months, but I think like most people will want to skip over it and just go right into kind of the purchasing or the work. But I just don't think you can really get ahead without taking the time to do something like this. That's my take.
I think that's fantastic. Yeah, we're actually going to steal some of this to put in some of our content as well, just as a template for L&D, an ops person, somebody in enablement, to help them with a process and a guide as they go when stakeholders pull them in for, hey, we're evaluating this tool, or hey, we just bought this tool, we got to roll it out and help with adoption. And they're working a little bit behind the eight ball. They can pick and choose from this list to kind of be like, okay, this is the process we should have went through. We skipped a couple of these things. Now they have like a defensible argument to kind of like, this is a process that makes more sense. So for the next ask that comes along, the next tech stack audit or request or things like that, they have something to turn to. So it's not just them having to get defensive. So I really like these kind of frameworks. I think that's very well laid out. And yeah, kudos for you for kind of putting it in such a logical order. I think it makes a ton of sense.
Yeah, and like I said, perfection's enemy of the good. So it doesn't always all of it has to get done, but I think if you can at least put some effort into a few of those where it makes sense based upon where you're at, you'll see benefits down the road.
Love it. Pasha, this is incredible. I really appreciate you. Let me jump all over the place and ping you with questions and thoughts here. As we kind of wrap up here, where can folks find you, more information about you? Where's the best place to do that?
Yeah, so LinkedIn, I'm on there. I'm either lurking or trying to post more again. I had a posting streak that got broken and just kind of getting back into it. I'm also trying to be more active on the HubSpot community. So I'm trying to answer 1 to 3 questions a day. You can find me in some different Slack channels, but mainly LinkedIn. So if you ever have a question, feel free to reach out.
Awesome. Love this. We'll link to everything in here so everybody can take a look at that. But Pasha, thanks again for being here, man. This is really helpful and sharing all your wisdom.
Thank you.